The Clark-Doll test was a famous psychological study that had a significant impact on public policy. Now, that's not always the case. The goal of many psychological researchers is to conduct research that could have an impact on societal functioning, but this study really had a very large impact in our history. So Mamie and Kenneth Clark were two African American psychologists, and in the 1940s they wanted to understand the psychological effects of segregation on African American children. At the time, African American children often were segregated in separate schools, couldn't use the same facilities, etc., often made to live a separate life from white children. Of course, that was also true for adults. And so they wanted to understand how this was impacting the psychological development, self-esteem, beliefs about self in children. So children aged 3 to 7 were given a choice of dolls. The dolls were either black or white, and the psychologist asked a series of questions. So for example, give me the doll that you like to play with, or the doll that you like best. Give me the doll that is the nice doll. Give me the doll that looks bad. Give me the doll that is a nice color. Give me the doll that looks like you, etc., etc. The findings in the 1940s were that the majority of black children, and the study was just looking at black children initially, the majority of black children preferred the white doll as opposed to the black doll and believed it had more positive qualities. So they tended to prefer the white doll and assign it more positive qualities. So the question that researchers started to ask themselves was, how might such beliefs impact the development of children? So if they're growing up in a society where the larger culture already is intolerant of African Americans, and then at a more personal level, they're experiencing not only racism but also segregation, not having the same facilities as white children. How does that impact their self-esteem? How does it impact how they see themselves, etc.? And so the Clark psychologists were framing this issue within the conditions of the larger society. How were the societal conditions impacting child psychological functioning? And so these findings were influential in the Brown versus Board of Education uh, Supreme Court finding. Uh, the Supreme Court stated that to separate African American children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. So essentially, it was an argument that segregation was impacting how African American children viewed themselves. And this was one of the arguments, not the only argument, but one of the arguments that led to the desegregation of schools. Back then, many schools were segregated by law. And at that point, based on Brown versus Board of Education, schools were now desegregated. And so this psychology study played an important role and was cited by the Supreme Court in coming to this conclusion. Interestingly, later psychologists have criticized the Clark-Doll test to some extent because they have found that even though some of those black children showed a preference for the white doll, they may still actually have positive self-esteem. So they may be showing some preference for the white doll, but it doesn't necessarily have a one-to-one correlation or relationship with the idea that they have low self-esteem. So their self-esteem probably has a lot of variability. Some of them might have high self-esteem, some might have low self-esteem. So even if they're showing a preference for the white doll, it doesn't necessarily mean they have low self-esteem. So that was probably a variable that could be included in future versions of the study to see whether it really is a linkage between self-esteem or not. And so the study was carried out again with black and white children in 2010. And there were many findings, but one important finding was that black children's bias towards the white dolls had decreased significantly as compared to how they reacted in the original study. So they were showing far less bias towards white dolls, still some bias, but far less than in the original study. And this is to be expected, but it is interesting to consider how our society has changed and how that as a result has shaped and changed how children see themselves. In our society, since the 1940s, there's been enormous changes in terms of gains in legal rights. Institutionalized racism, at least from a legal perspective, is no longer permitted. So, of course, there still is discrimination. There still are problems within our society. There still is racism, etc. But we do see a lot of changes since the 1940s. And so, as a result of all of that, we might see changes in the self perception of minority groups within the society. So, this is just kind of a nice example about how societal norms, cultural values, etc., play a role in shaping the psychology of its members, particularly its minority members, and how changes in our um, historical rights, social justice movements can lead to changes in psychological beliefs. And so, in the last section of this lecture, we're going to look at socioeconomic status and health. So, it's very important to consider, how does living in a situation where financial resources are more constrained, where there's more stress about that, more maybe insecurity about financial stability, how that might impact psychological functioning and a sense of well-being. And so many research studies have found that low socioeconomic status is linked to higher rates of chronic disease in childhood and adulthood. And the findings are pretty striking, that in childhood, if you're exposed to a fair amount of poverty and the instability that that can lead to in terms of not being certain about housing, not being certain about having financial resources, that can lead to greater disease. And of course, this is not destiny. As I mentioned throughout this course, it is not destiny that if you've had experienced poverty, you're going to have poor health. Absolutely not. But we're just looking at some of the trends. There's always variability and there's always exceptions. And so researchers are really interested in this relationship and have tried to really understand why this might be. And one key factor seems to be stress. So children who may experience poverty may experience higher levels of stress because there's less certainty about things, less certainty about money and about housing. And as a result, the stress may be sort of a key linking factor that then contributes to poorer physical health. So again, this is not destiny. It's not true for every person who has experienced poverty by any means, but it is a trend we do see in the psychological literature. But again, there's always exceptions. And so, what are some protective factors for individuals experiencing poverty? It has been found that uh, individuals, children who are experiencing poverties, who tend to have supportive role models, who tend to have individuals in their lives, whether it's parents or older siblings or teachers or just individuals who are supportive role models helping them through. And this is actually a finding that really generalizes to many populations, that role of supportive role models. But nonetheless, when they have those supportive role models, it actually seems to have like a buffering effect. It actually seems to lead to less uh, problems with physical health. So why might that be? Why might it be that if you're experiencing the stress of poverty, but you have supportive role models, you tend to have better physical health? And researchers suggest that role models may play a role in helping children learn to manage stress. So that's one proposed pathway. It may be that if you have these positive role models, then they help you learn to manage the stress, and so that you're able to then have better physical health across time.